I moved to Lochmaganic in early March 2019, 6 years after the disaster that had nearly destroyed the town. I'd taken a job with an environmental consulting firm, working on ongoing remediation efforts from the rail accident that had killed 47 people and leveled a significant portion of downtown. The work was steady, the pay was decent, and I needed a fresh start after a difficult divorce. I rented a small apartment above a bakery on Rue Frontenac, one of the streets that had survived the fire. The apartment was modest, one bedroom, a tiny kitchen, a living room with windows that looked out onto the street, but it was affordable and close to my office. The landlord, an older man named Jean-Paul, who ran the bakery below, seemed relieved to have a tenant. He told me the apartment had been empty for 8 months. The town itself was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. People went about their business with a kind of subdued determination, rebuilding what had been lost, maintaining what had survived. But there was a heaviness to the place, a sense of collective grief that hung in the air like morning fog. You could see it in the memorial park downtown, in the plaques bearing names of the dead, in the way people's eyes would shift away when you mentioned the disaster. I'd been warned about this before I moved. Lochmaganic is still healing, my supervisor had said. The people there have been through something terrible. Be respectful, be patient. I intended to be both. The first few weeks were unremarkable. I worked long days, came home to my apartment, cooked simple meals, and fell asleep to the sound of the town settling into night. The bakery below would close at 6, and Jean-Paul would leave through the back entrance. By 7, the street was usually quiet, just the occasional car passing by. Then, on my third week there, I woke up at exactly 3 a.m. I knew it was exactly 3 because I'd glanced at my phone immediately upon waking, trying to figure out what had pulled me from sleep. The apartment was dark and quiet. No sirens outside, no noise from neighboring units, nothing obvious. And then I heard it. Church bells. They were distant but clear, a slow, solemn tolling that echoed through the night. I lay there listening, counting the rings. 12 of them, the traditional toll for marking the hour. But it was 3 in the morning, not noon or midnight. I got out of bed and went to the window, looking out onto Rue Frontenac. The street was empty, lit by yellow streetlights. The sound of the bells continued, and I tried to pinpoint where it was coming from. There were 2 churches in Lochmaganic that I knew of: Saint Agnes, which had been destroyed in the fire, and Saint Eusebe, which was several blocks away on a hill overlooking the town. But the bells didn't sound like they were coming from Saint Eusebe. They sounded closer, more central, like they were coming from downtown. I stood at the window for maybe 5 minutes, listening as the bells continued their slow, measured tolling. Then, as abruptly as they'd started, they stopped. The night returned to silence. I went back to bed, assuming it was some kind of memorial tradition I didn't know about. Maybe the town rang bells at 3 a.m. to mark the time of the disaster, which had occurred in the early morning hours of the 6th of July 2013. But the next night, it happened again. 3 a.m. exactly. The same bells, the same slow tolling. I checked my phone to see if there was any mention of it online, any explanation for why church bells would be ringing in the middle of the night. I found nothing. The third night, I decided to investigate. When the bells started at 3 a.m., I got dressed quickly and left my apartment, heading out onto the street. The night was cold, frost still clinging to car windshields, my breath fogging in the air. I followed the sound of the bells, walking toward downtown. The streets were completely empty, not a single car or person visible, just me and the sound of bells echoing between the buildings. The sound led me to the site where St. August's Church had stood. Now it was just an empty lot, a memorial park with plaques and benches. The church had been one of the buildings destroyed in the fire, and it had never been rebuilt. Just grass and paved walkways, and that eternal reminder of what had been lost. I stood at the edge of the lot, and the bells were louder here. So loud it felt like they were right in front of me, like I should be able to reach out and touch the bell tower that no longer existed. But there was nothing there, just empty space where a church had once stood. I walked onto the lot, moving toward the center where the church's foundation would have been. The bells continued their tolling, the sound surrounding me now, coming from all directions and no direction at once. And then I saw them. There were people at the far edge of the lot, maybe a dozen of them, standing in a loose group, all facing the empty space where the church had been. They were perfectly still, their faces illuminated slightly by the distant streetlights. I walked toward them, raising my hand in greeting. "Excuse me," I called out in French. "Do you hear the bells too?" None of them responded. None of them even looked at me. They just stood there, staring at the empty lot, their expressions blank and distant. I moved closer, now close enough to see their faces clearly. They were people of all ages, older men and women, middle-aged couples, even a few younger people who might have been in their 20s. All of them dressed in regular clothes, not robes or ceremonial garments or anything that suggested this was some kind of organized ritual. "Hello?" I tried again, now standing just a few feet from the nearest person, a woman maybe in her 60s with gray hair pulled back in a bun. She didn't react, didn't blink, didn't move at all. None of them did. The bells continued ringing, and I stood there among these frozen people, feeling increasingly uneasy. There was something wrong about this, something that went beyond simple strangeness. These people weren't just quiet or lost in thought. They seemed absent, like their bodies were here, but their minds were somewhere else entirely. The bells stopped. The moment the sound ceased, the people began to disperse. They turned and walked away, moving slowly and mechanically, heading off in different directions without acknowledging each other or me. Within a minute, they were all gone, disappeared into the dark streets of Lac Mégantic. I stood alone in the memorial park, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. Over the next few days, I asked people about the bells. I mentioned it to Jean-Paul when I saw him at the bakery. He frowned and said he'd never heard any bells at night, that Saint-Eusèbe only rang its bells during the day for services and special occasions. I asked a coworker, a woman named Marie, who'd lived in Lac Mégantic her whole life. She gave me a strange look and said there were no bells at 3 a.m., that I must have been dreaming. But I knew I wasn't dreaming. I'd walked to that lot. I'd seen those people. I started paying attention to the people I'd seen that night, trying to recognize them during the day. I thought I spotted a few of them, the gray-haired woman at the grocery store, a middle-aged man at the post office, but I couldn't be sure. And when I tried to approach them, to ask if they'd been at the memorial park, they'd avoid me or claim not to know what I was talking about. Every night at 3 a.m., the bells would ring. Every night, I'd resist the urge to go to the memorial park to see if those people were there again. But the temptation grew stronger. Finally, 2 weeks after that first night, I went back. The bells started at 3 a.m. as always. I dressed and walked to the memorial park, and sure enough, there they were. The same people, standing at the edge of the lot, staring at the empty space where Saint Agnes had stood. But there were more of them now, maybe 20 people instead of a dozen, new faces I hadn't seen before. I didn't try to talk to them this time. I just stood at a distance and watched. The bells tolled their slow, measured rhythm, and these people stood motionless, listening to something that shouldn't exist. When the bells stopped, they dispersed as before, walking away into the night without a word. I started documenting it. I took photos from a distance, recorded the sound of the bells on my phone, but when I played back the recordings, there was nothing. Just ambient noise, distant traffic, wind, the normal sounds of a quiet town at night. No bells. And the photos showed the empty lot, the memorial plaques, the benches, but no people, even though I'd been looking right at them when I took the pictures. I tried to research the phenomenon, looking for any mention of it in local news or historical records. I found articles about the disaster, about the memorial services, about the ongoing recovery, but nothing about bells ringing at 3 a.m. Nothing about people gathering at the memorial park in the middle of the night. I began to dread 3 a.m. I'd lie awake, waiting for the bells to start, knowing that when they did, I'd have to resist the urge to go to the memorial park, because part of me was terrified of what I might see if I kept watching. Terrified that one night I might find myself standing with them, frozen and staring at nothing, listening to bells that existed only in the space between what was and what should have been. One night, about a month after I'd first heard the bells, I woke at 3 a.m. and they didn't ring. I lay there in bed, waiting, almost hoping to hear them, just so I'd know I wasn't losing my mind. But there was only silence. The next night, the same. No bells. I felt a strange mix of relief and loss. Then, on the third night of silence, I had a dream. I was standing in St. Agnes Church, though I'd never seen the interior before it burned. The church was full of people, all of them sitting in pews, all of them facing the altar, and at the altar stood a priest, speaking in French, giving a sermon I couldn't quite hear. The people in the pews began to turn, one by one, looking back at me. Their faces were the faces I'd seen at the memorial park. The gray-haired woman, the middle-aged man, all of them. And they were staring at me with empty eyes, their mouths moving in silent prayer. Then the church bells began to ring. But they weren't above me in the bell tower. They were coming from below, from beneath the floor, from the ground itself. I woke up gasping and immediately heard them. The bells, 3 a.m. They'd started again. This time I didn't resist. I got up and walked to the memorial park, and when I arrived, I saw them. More people than before, maybe 30 of them now, standing at the edge of the lot, and they were all looking at me. Not staring blankly into space, looking directly at me, their eyes following me as I approached. I stopped at the edge of the lot, suddenly afraid to go any closer. The bells continued ringing, and as they did, one of the people stepped forward, the gray-haired woman. She walked toward me slowly, her expression still blank but her eyes locked on mine. She stopped a few feet away and opened her mouth, but instead of words, what came out was the sound of bells. The same slow tolling, but emanating from her throat, impossibly loud. I ran. I turned and ran back to my apartment, my heart hammering, the sound of bells echoing behind me. I locked my door and sat on my bed, shaking, until the bells finally stopped. I moved out of Lac-Mégantic 2 weeks later, told my employer I needed to relocate for personal reasons, told Jean-Paul the apartment wasn't working out. I packed my things and left, driving away from that quiet town with its heavy grief and its impossible bells. But I still hear them sometimes. Late at night, when I'm on the edge of sleep, the slow, solemn tolling of church bells that shouldn't ring. And I wonder if one day I'll wake up and find myself standing at the edge of that memorial park, staring at nothing, waiting for bells that will never stop ringing. Because some losses are too great to recover from. Some grief echoes forever, calling back the dead and the living alike, binding them together in rituals that exist outside of time and reason. And Lac-Mégantic's bells will keep ringing at 3 a.m., keep calling people to stand and listen, keep marking a moment of destruction that refuses to be forgotten, that demands to be remembered even in the darkest hours of the night. I just pray I never answer that call again. I was driving along Route 132 near Rimouski on a Thursday night in late October, heading east toward Gaspé for a long weekend fishing trip. I'd left Montreal around noon, and the drive had taken longer than expected. Traffic around Quebec City had been heavy, and I'd stopped for dinner in Rivière-du-Loup, not wanting to arrive at my friend's cabin too late. By the time I was passing through Rimouski, it was already dark, the sun setting early that time of year, the daylight swallowed up by 6 p.m. Route 132 follows the south shore of the St. Lawrence River, a two-lane highway that winds through small towns and stretches of forest. During the day, it's scenic, with views of the river and the mountains beyond. At night, it's isolated and dark, with long stretches between settlements, where the only light comes from your headlights and the occasional passing car. I had the radio on, some French-language station playing classic rock, and I was making good time. The traffic had thinned out considerably once I'd left Rimouski behind, and now it was mostly just me and the occasional transport truck heading in the opposite direction. About 20 kilometers outside of Rimouski, I saw her. She was standing on the shoulder of the highway, right at the edge where the pavement met the gravel. At first, I thought it was just a reflective sign or a piece of debris, but as my headlights got closer, I realized it was a person. A young woman, maybe in her 20s, wearing a white coat. Her arm was extended, thumb out in the universal hitchhiker's gesture. I should have kept driving. Every rational part of my brain told me to keep going, that picking up hitchhikers, especially at night, especially in the middle of nowhere, was a bad idea. But something made me slow down. Maybe it was the isolation of the moment, the thought of someone stranded out here in the cold. Maybe it was the fact that I'd been driving for hours and was getting tired, and the idea of some company seemed appealing. Or maybe it was something else, something I can't explain. I pulled over about 10 meters past where she was standing, my hazard lights flashing. I watched in my rearview mirror as she walked toward the car, her movement slow and deliberate. She reached the passenger door and opened it without hesitation, sliding into the seat beside me. The interior light came on, and I got my first clear look at her. She was young, probably mid-20s, with long dark hair that hung wet and stringy around her face. The white coat she wore was soaked through, water dripping onto the seat and floor mat. Her skin was pale, almost gray in the dim light, and her eyes were dark and unfocused. "Bonsoir," I said, trying to sound casual despite the unease creeping up my spine. "Where are you headed?" She didn't respond immediately, just sat there, staring straight ahead through the windshield. The smell hit me then, a strong, organic smell like river water and rot, like wet earth and decay. I turned down the radio and asked again in French, "Où allez-vous?" "Chez moi," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Home. J'essaie de rentrer chez moi depuis si longtemps. I've been trying to get home for so long." Her accent was local, the Bas Saint-Laurent French that I'd been hearing all day. But there was something odd about her phrasing, something that sounded old-fashioned or formal. "Where's home?" I asked, putting the car back in drive and pulling onto the highway. She didn't answer, just continued staring ahead, her hands folded in her lap. I noticed her clothes, then the white coat was clearly soaked, but underneath she was wearing what looked like jeans and a sweater, regular clothes. But they were dripping wet, water pooling on the floor mat beneath her feet. "Are you okay?" I asked. "Did your car break down? Do you need me to call someone?" "Just drive," she said softly. "I'll tell you when to stop." There was something in her tone that discouraged further questions. I drove in silence, the radio off now, just the sound of the engine and the wet breathing of my passenger. I kept glancing at her out of the corner of my eye. She never moved, never shifted position, just sat there perfectly still with her hands folded and her eyes fixed on something in the distance I couldn't see. The smell was getting stronger, that river rot smell filling the car, despite the cold October air coming through the vents. I cracked my window slightly, trying to get some fresh air without being too obvious about it. We drove for maybe 10 minutes, passing no other cars, no houses, nothing but forest on both sides of the highway. The trees pressed close to the road here, their branches hanging over the pavement, creating a tunnel of darkness that my headlights barely penetrated. "Arrêtez ici," she said suddenly. "Stop here." I looked around. We were in the middle of nowhere, no buildings or intersections or anything to indicate why we'd stop at this particular spot. Just forest and darkness, and the empty highway stretching ahead. "There's nothing here," I said. "Are you sure this is—" "Ici," she insisted, more firmly. "Here." I pulled over onto the shoulder, my hazard lights flashing again. She opened the door immediately, the interior light coming on. In that brief illumination, I saw her more clearly, the way her hair was plastered to her face, the way her skin had that gray, lifeless quality, the way her eyes were completely black in the light, no whites visible at all. She got out of the car and stood there for a moment, looking at the forest. Then she started walking, moving away from the highway and into the trees. "Wait," I called out, opening my own door. "Where are you going? You can't just—" She kept walking, not looking back, her white coat visible in my headlights as she moved between the trees. I got out of the car and followed her a few steps, stopping at the edge of the forest. "Mademoiselle, you need help? Should I call someone?" She didn't respond, just kept walking deeper into the woods, her white coat getting fainter and fainter until it disappeared completely into the darkness. I stood there for a long moment, torn between the impulse to follow her and the growing certainty that something was very wrong about this entire situation. The smell lingered in the air, that river rot smell, and I could hear water dripping, though I couldn't see any source. Finally, I got back in my car and drove. I drove fast, faster than I should have on that dark highway, until I reached the next town, a small place called Saint Flavie, about 15 kilometers up the road. I pulled into the parking lot of a gas station that was still open and went inside. The clerk, a middle-aged man with a tired expression, looked up from his magazine. "Do you have a phone I can use?" I asked in French. "I need to call the police." He gestured to a payphone on the wall, and I called the local police station. When an officer answered, I explained what had happened, that I'd picked up a hitchhiker, that she'd asked to be let out in the middle of nowhere, that she'd walked into the forest and I was worried about her safety. "Where exactly did she get out?" the officer asked. I described the location as best I could, about 30 kilometers west of Saint Flavie, near a section where the forest came close to the road. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Can you describe this woman?" I did. Young, maybe mid-20s, long dark hair, wearing a white coat, soaking wet despite no rain. The smell like river water. Another pause. longer this time. Come to the station. I think we need to talk in person. The police station was a small building just off the main road. I drove there and was met by the officer I'd spoken to on the phone, a man in his 50s named Sergeant Bouchard. He led me to a small office and gestured for me to sit down. "Tell me again exactly what happened," he said. I went through the whole story, seeing her on the highway, picking her up, the drive, her asking me to stop, her walking into the forest. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as I talked. When I finished, he opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a file folder. He flipped through several pages and then pulled out a photograph, a missing person poster, yellowed with age. "Is this the woman you picked up?" he asked, sliding it across the desk. I looked at the photo. It showed a young woman with long dark hair, smiling at the camera. She was wearing different clothes than the woman I'd picked up, but the face was the same, unmistakably the same. "Yes," I said, "that's her. Who is she?" Sergeant Bouchard leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Her name was Catherine Dufresne. She went missing on October 23rd, 1989, 30 years ago, almost to the day." I felt my stomach drop. "Missing? What happened to her?" "She was a student at the university in Rimouski, 19 years old. She'd been visiting a friend in St. Flavie and was hitchhiking back to Rimouski. Someone saw her on Route 132 around 6 p.m., right around where you said you picked up your passenger. She was never seen again. But I just saw her, tonight. She got in my car." The official theory was that she drowned in the Rimouski River. We had heavy rain that week, and the river was high and fast. They found her jacket downstream a few days later, caught in some branches, but they never found her body. The case was never solved. I stared at the photo, at the smiling young woman who couldn't possibly be the same person I'd had in my car 20 minutes ago. "You're not the first person to report seeing her," Sergeant Bouchard continued. "Over the years, we've had maybe a dozen reports. Always the same stretch of highway. Always a young woman in a white coat, soaking wet, hitchhiking. People pick her up, drive her for a bit. She asks to be let out in the middle of nowhere, and she walks into the forest." "That's impossible," I said, though I knew it wasn't. I knew what I'd seen, what I'd smelled, the way she'd felt wrong from the moment she got in my car. The last report we had was about 5 years ago, always in late October, around the anniversary of her disappearance. We've searched those woods dozens of times over the years, never found anything. No body, no trace of her. He pulled out another photo from the file, this one showing the forest near Route 132. "The theory some people have is that she's trying to get home, that she's retracing her route from that night, but she never makes it. Something happened to her in those woods, and she's been trying to get through them for 30 years. I left the police station around midnight, my hands still shaking. Sergeant Bouchard had offered to have an officer follow me to make sure I got to my friend's cabin safely, but I declined. I just wanted to get out of there, to put distance between myself and that stretch of highway where Catherine Dufresne still walked, still tried to get home. I never finished that fishing trip. I stayed one night at my friend's cabin and then drove back to Montreal the next day, taking a different route that avoided Route 132 entirely. But I think about her sometimes, about Catherine Dufresne, 19 years old, caught in an eternal loop of trying to get home, about how she'd said she'd been trying for so long, and I understand now what she meant. 30 years of walking that highway, getting into cars with strangers, being driven a few kilometers closer to wherever she was going, only to have to get out and walk into those woods where something terrible happened. And I wonder if she'll ever make it home, if whatever's keeping her on that highway will ever let her complete her journey, or if she's doomed to hitchhike forever, soaking wet and smelling of the river, asking drivers to let her out in the darkness so she can walk into those woods one more time. I wonder if one day someone will pick her up and she'll make it all the way. And I wonder what will happen then, when she finally reaches the end of that long road home. But mostly I wonder why I stopped. What made me pull over that night? What compelled me to let her into my car? Because part of me thinks it wasn't my choice at all. Part of me thinks that everyone who stops for her does so because they have to, because she's still trying to get home and she needs our help to do it. And every year, on October 23rd, someone drives that stretch of Route 132 near Rimouski, and they see a young woman in a white coat, thumb out, standing on the shoulder of the road. And they stop, because they have to, because Catherine Dufresne is still trying to get home. I started working security at the old Hôpital Saint-Michel Archange in Quebec City in September 2018. The hospital had been a psychiatric facility for over a century before closing in the mid-90s, and now the building had been partially converted to offices, mostly government administrative departments that needed cheap space. But the conversion was incomplete. Maybe 2/3 of the massive building sat empty, the upper floors and most of the basement left exactly as they'd been when the hospital shut down. My job was simple: do rounds 3 times per night at 10 p.m., 2 a.m., and 6 a.m., making sure all the doors and windows were secure, that no one had broken in, that everything was as it should be. The rest of the time, I sat in a small security office near the main entrance, watching monitors connected to cameras scattered throughout the building. The pay was decent for night shift work, and I needed the money. I was putting myself through university during the day, and this job let me study during the quiet hours between rounds. The building manager who hired me, a tired-looking man named Robert, had been straightforward about the job's challenges. "It's an old building," he'd said. "It makes noise. Pipes clank, floors creak, wind rattles the windows. You'll hear things. Don't let it spook you. And don't go into areas that aren't part of your patrol route. Some sections aren't structurally sound." He'd given me a map of the building with my route marked in red. The occupied office areas, the main corridors, the exits, and the basement, or at least the main basement corridor. I was supposed to walk its length, checking that the doors were locked, but I wasn't supposed to enter any of the rooms. The first few weeks were uneventful. The building was exactly as Robert had described: old, creaky, full of sounds that seemed louder in the empty hours after midnight. But nothing that couldn't be explained by settling wood and metal, by wind and temperature changes. The occupied areas were normal enough modern offices with fluorescent lights in cubicles, people's family photos on desks, the mundane details of bureaucratic work. But the abandoned sections were different. Walking through them felt like stepping back in time. Patient rooms with beds still in place, their thin mattresses stained and torn. Day rooms with chairs arranged in circles, as if patients might return at any moment for group therapy. And everywhere, the institutional green paint, peeling and faded, covering walls that held decades of suffering. The basement was the worst. It was where they'd kept the most severe cases, the patients who needed constant supervision or restraint. The main corridor was wide and long, lit by flickering fluorescent tubes that Robert had installed for the security patrols. But the rooms that branched off from it were dark, and many still contained the equipment and furniture from when the hospital was operational. I'd look through the small windows in the doors during my rounds, reinforced glass with wire mesh, the kind designed to prevent patients from breaking through. Inside, I'd see restraint tables with leather straps still bolted to the frames, padded cells with walls that had been clawed at, the padding torn away to reveal the concrete beneath, rooms with drains in the floor and hoses coiled in corners, remnants of whatever procedures had been done there. The doors were all locked, and I had no keys for them. My job was just to check that they remained locked, that no one had tampered with them. I'd test each handle, mark it off on my checklist, and move on. It was during my 4th week, on a Tuesday night in early October, that I first heard it. I was doing my 2 a.m. round, making my way through the basement corridor. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting unstable shadows. I was about halfway down the corridor when I heard singing. A woman's voice, soft and distant, singing in French. The melody was mournful, slow, the kind of song you might hear at a funeral. I couldn't make out all the words, but I caught fragments, something about darkness, about waiting, about souls that couldn't rest. I stopped walking and listened, trying to determine where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be emanating from one of the rooms ahead of me, toward the end of the corridor. I moved forward slowly, checking each door as I passed. The singing grew louder as I approached the end of the corridor, and I finally identified which room it was coming from: the last door on the left, marked only with a faded number, B47. I'd checked this door dozens of times before. It was always locked, the small window showing nothing but an empty room inside. But now there was singing coming from behind it. I stood in front of the door and looked through the window. The room beyond was dark, barely illuminated by the light spilling in from the corridor. I could see it was empty, just bare walls, peeling paint, and a drain in the center of the floor. No furniture, no equipment, nothing that could produce sound. But the singing continued, clear and distinct, definitely coming from inside that room. I tried the handle, locked, as always. The singing stopped the moment I touched the door, cutting off mid-note, leaving only silence. I stood there for a long moment, my hand still on the handle, listening. Nothing, just the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sound of water running through old pipes. I told myself it had been my imagination, or sound traveling through the ventilation system, or maybe someone in one of the offices above playing music. I marked the door as checked and continued my round, but I couldn't shake the unease. The next night, I heard it again. Same time, 2 a.m., same corridor. The singing started as soon as I entered the basement, that same mournful melody, that same woman's voice. And again, it was coming from room B47. This time I approached the door more cautiously. The singing continued as I got closer, and I pressed my ear against the door, listening carefully. The voice was clear, singing about shadows and sorrow, about souls trapped in darkness, about wanting to go home. I pulled out my flashlight and shone it through the window, trying to see if there was anything in the room I'd missed before. The beam illuminated the bare space walls, floor, drain, nothing else. I tried the handle again, still locked, and again, the singing stopped the moment I touched the door. But this time, something else happened. As the singing cut off, I heard other sounds from inside the room. Movement, shuffling feet, and then whispers, multiple voices, talking quietly to each other in French, words I couldn't quite make out. I stepped back from the door, my heart pounding. This wasn't my imagination. This was real. There were people in that room, or something that sounded like people, and there was no way they should be able to get in there. I considered unlocking the door to investigate, but something stopped me. The whispers had a quality that made my skin crawl, a tone that suggested whatever was making those sounds wasn't something I wanted to confront. I finished my round quickly and went back to the security office. I checked the camera feeds for the basement, but the coverage was limited, cameras only at the entrance to the basement stairs and at the far end of the main corridor. Nothing that would show what was happening at room B47. I considered reporting it to Robert, but what would I say? That I'd heard singing from a locked, empty room? That I'd heard voices that stopped when I tried to open the door? He'd think I was crazy or looking for attention. The following night, I dreaded the 2 a.m. round, but I had to do my job. I entered the basement corridor at exactly 2, and immediately I heard it. Singing, but not just one voice this time. Multiple voices, maybe dozens of them, all singing the same mournful song in harmony. The sound was coming from the end of the corridor, from room B47 and the rooms surrounding it. I walked slowly down the corridor, my flashlight beam cutting through the dim fluorescent light. As I got closer, I could distinguish different voices, women and men, young and old, all singing together in perfect, haunting harmony. I reached room B47 and stopped. The singing was loudest here, but it was also coming from the other doors nearby. I looked through the windows of adjacent rooms, B45, B46, B48, B49, all empty, all showing nothing but bare walls and old drains. But the singing continued, growing in volume and intensity, and now I could hear other sounds beneath the melody, crying, moaning, the sound of hands or fists pounding on walls. I stood in that corridor, surrounded by locked doors and empty rooms, listening to a chorus of voices that shouldn't exist. And I understood suddenly that I was hearing the remnants of everyone who had suffered in this basement, all the patients who had been locked in these rooms, restrained and medicated and forgotten. This was their song, their endless lament, and they were still here, still locked in these rooms, still waiting for someone to let them out. I didn't unlock any of the doors. I didn't investigate further. I just stood there listening until the song gradually faded, the voices dropping away one by one until only silence remained. Then I walked back to the security office, wrote my resignation letter, and left it on Robert's desk. I finished my shift, did my 6 a.m. round in the upper floors while avoiding the basement entirely, and never came back. I submitted my resignation via email the next day. Robert called me, asked if everything was okay, if something had happened. I told him the job wasn't a good fit, that I needed something with different hours. "You're the third guard to quit this month," he said, frustration clear in his voice. "Did you hear something in the basement?" I didn't answer directly. "I think you should tell new hires about the basement before they start, about what they might hear down there." There was a long pause. "I can't tell them things I don't understand myself. The building has a history. Bad things happened here, sometimes. He trailed off. Sometimes places remember. Sometimes they can't let go. I never went back to Hôpital Saint-Michel Archange. But I think about it sometimes, about those voices singing their mournful song in locked rooms, about all the suffering that soaked into those walls over a century of operation. I think about room B47 and the woman's voice I heard that first night, singing alone in the darkness. I think about how her voice was joined by others, how the basement filled with the sound of people who couldn't escape, who were still trapped there even after the hospital closed, even after everyone else had moved on. And I wonder if they're still singing, night after night, their voices echoing through empty corridors, waiting for someone to hear them, to acknowledge their suffering, to finally let them rest. I wonder how many security guards have heard them over the years. How many have stood in that basement corridor and listened to the impossible chorus? And I wonder how many more will hear it before someone finally admits that the hospital never really closed, that some patients never really left, that suffering that deep doesn't just end when the doors are locked and the lights are turned off. It echoes, it persists, it sings. And somewhere in the basement of that old hospital, room B47 waits in the darkness, and at 2 a.m., the song begins again. My Uncle Mark didn't talk much about his time working in the logging camps up north. He'd done it for maybe 5 years in the mid-70s. Hard work that paid well, but took its toll on a man's body and spirit. He'd come back south to Montreal in 1977 and got a job in construction, settled down, started a family. By the time I was old enough to ask questions, he'd been away from that life for decades. But one night when I was maybe 22, home from university for the holidays, I found him alone in my parents' garage, working on his truck. It was late, everyone else had gone to bed, and I'd come out to ask if he needed help. We worked in comfortable silence for a while, and then, unprompted, he started talking about Val d'Or. "I ever tell you about the winter of '76? He asked, his hands busy with a wrench, his eyes focused on the engine. I said he hadn't. He was quiet for a long moment, and I thought maybe he'd changed his mind about sharing. But then he set down the wrench and wiped his hands on a rag, his expression distant. "We were working a camp about 80 kilometers northeast of Val d'Or," he began, "deep in the bush, accessible only by logging roads that got snowed in for weeks at a time. There were maybe 20 of us living in these prefab buildings they'd hauled in dormitories, a kitchen, a equipment shed. We'd work from dawn until dark, cutting timber, and then we'd eat and sleep and do it all again the next day." He explained that the camps would operate through the winter, the men staying for 3 or 4 weeks at a stretch before getting a few days off to go back to town. It was isolated, brutal work, but it paid better than anything else available to men with limited education and strong backs. "February 1976 was cold," he continued. "Even by northern Quebec standards, it was brutal. Temperatures dropping to -30, -40 at night. We'd work shorter days because the equipment would freeze up, the hydraulics would seize. But we still had quotas to meet, so we pushed through." That's when the sound started. It began maybe 2 weeks into their rotation. Mark and the other men would be in the dormitory at night, trying to sleep, when they'd hear footsteps outside. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching through the snow, circling the camp. At first, they assumed it was one of the other workers going to the latrine or out for a smoke. But when they checked, everyone would be accounted for, all 20 men in their bunks. The footsteps would continue for hours sometimes, making slow circuits around the buildings. The camp foreman, a man named Dosset, thought it might be a bear, but bears should have been hibernating. And besides, the footsteps didn't sound like a bear. They sounded too measured, too purposeful. "One morning, we found tracks," Mark said. "Fresh snow had fallen overnight, and there was a clear trail circling the entire camp. Footprints, human footprints, barefoot, pressed deep into the snow. The men gathered around the tracks, trying to make sense of them. The prints were large, bigger than any of the workers' feet, and they were spaced evenly, like whoever made them had been walking with perfect, mechanical regularity. But what disturbed them most was the fact that they were barefoot. In -30 weather, someone had been walking around their camp with no protection on their feet. Doucette thought it was a prank," Mark continued. "Said maybe someone had carved fake feet out of wood, attached them to poles, and made the tracks to scare us. But the prints were deep, pressed into the snow with weight. They were real. They followed the tracks. The footprints didn't lead to or from anywhere. They just circled the camp in perfect loops, maybe 20 or 30 circuits, and then they stopped abruptly in the middle of the clearing. No trail leading into the forest, no indication of where the person had come from or gone to. Just circles in the snow, and then nothing. The men were spooked, but tried to dismiss it. Northern Quebec was isolated, and there were stories about hermits and trappers who lived deep in the bush, people who'd gone feral or strange after years alone. Maybe someone like that had wandered near the camp, circled it out of curiosity, and left. But the footsteps came back the next night, and the night after that, we started keeping watch, Mark said, taking turns sitting up with flashlights, trying to catch whoever it was. But we never saw anything. The footsteps would start up around 11 or midnight, and we'd hear them clear as day, but when we'd shine lights out into the darkness, there was nothing there. Just snow and trees and that sound of something walking in circles around us. Then Gerard disappeared. Gerard Tremblay was one of the older workers, a quiet man in his 50s who'd been working logging camps for decades. On a Tuesday night in mid-February, he went to bed at his usual time, exhausted from a long day of work. When the morning shift started gathering for breakfast, Gerard wasn't there. They checked the dormitory. His bunk was empty, the blankets thrown back like he'd gotten up in the middle of the night. His clothes were still hanging on the hook beside his bed, his coat, his boots, everything he'd need to survive outside. We organized a search immediately, Mark said. Doucet got us all together, and we spread out from the camp in teams of 2, following any trails we could find in the snow. It had snowed again during the night, so we were looking for fresh tracks, fresh disturbances. They found him 3 days later. 2 kilometers from camp, deep in the forest, Gerard Tremblay was sitting against a tree, frozen solid. He was wearing only his underwear, no shirt, no pants, no boots. His skin was gray and crystallized with frost, his eyes open and staring at nothing. The coroner said it was paradoxical, undressing. Mark explained. It's something that happens in severe hypothermia. Your body gets so cold that it tricks your brain, makes you feel hot, and you take off your clothes. People freeze to death half naked all the time. But that didn't explain why Gerard had left the warm dormitory in the middle of the night and walked 2 kilometers into the forest. There were no signs of struggle, no indication that he'd been forced. He'd just gotten up, walked out into the deadly cold wearing nothing but his underwear, and kept walking until the cold killed him. The company sent investigators. They tested for carbon monoxide, for gas leaks, for anything that might have caused hallucinations or confusion. They interviewed all the workers, asking if Gerard had seemed depressed or suicidal, if there had been any conflicts in the camp. Nothing. No explanation. Doucet wanted to shut down operations and send everyone home, but the company insisted they continue. They were behind on their quotas, and the winter season was short enough as it was. So the men stayed, and a week later, another man disappeared. Jacques Lefebvre, 34 years old, married with 2 kids, same pattern, went to bed normally, was gone by morning, left all his clothes and boots behind. They found him 18 hours later, less than a kilometer from camp, frozen in a clearing. He'd been walking in circles, his bare footprints creating loops in the snow, until he'd collapsed. That's when we really started to panic, Mark said. 2 men dead in mysterious circumstances, both of them doing something that made no sense. We demanded to be evacuated, but the roads were snowed in, and the company said it would take days to get equipment up there to clear the path. The 3rd disappearance happened 2 nights later. Paul Nadeau, one of the younger workers, maybe 25. He'd been terrified after Jacques' death, had told the others he wasn't sleeping, that he was afraid of what might happen if he closed his eyes. But exhaustion eventually won, and sometime after midnight, he got up from his bunk and walked outside into the -40 cold. They found him at dawn, sitting in the snow just outside the camp perimeter. He was still alive, barely, his body temperature so low he should have been dead. They wrapped him in blankets, tried to warm him slowly, but he died before they could get him back to civilization. Before he died, he said something, Mark told me, his voice quiet. He was delirious, barely conscious, but Doucet was with him when it happened. Paul said he'd heard singing, beautiful singing, coming from outside. He said he had to follow it, had to find where it was coming from. He said it promised to take him home. The camp was evacuated the next day. The company finally got equipment up there and cleared the roads, and they sent all the workers back to Val d'Or. The official report blamed a gas leak for causing hallucinations and disorientation. They sealed the camp, said they'd investigate thoroughly before reopening. But they never reopened it, Mark said. The camp was abandoned. As far as I know, those buildings are still out there, slowly falling apart in the bush northeast of Val-d'Or. I asked him if he believed the gas leak theory. He looked at me directly then, his expression serious. I saw the footprints, every night, fresh tracks circling the camp, barefoot prints in -30 weather. And I saw something else, something I didn't tell the investigators because they already thought we were crazy. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The last night before Paul disappeared, I was on watch. It was maybe 1 in the morning, and I was sitting near the window with a flashlight, listening to those footsteps circling the camp. I shined my light out into the woods, and I saw them. Saw what? Figures, standing in the tree line, just beyond the reach of the light. Maybe 5 or 6 of them, standing perfectly still, watching the camp. They were too far away to see clearly, but they looked human, tall and thin, standing in the snow with no clothes, no protection from the cold, just standing there, watching us. I asked if he'd told anyone. I woke up Doucet. By the time he got to the window, they were gone. He thought I'd been dreaming, that the stress was getting to me. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was seeing things. But he didn't sound like he believed that. We worked on the truck a while longer, and then he said something that I've never forgotten. There are places in this world where people aren't supposed to be. Places that belong to something else. Something that was there long before we showed up with our saws and our machines. We were cutting timber on land that had been forest for thousands of years, and maybe something in that forest didn't appreciate us being there. He put his tools away and started closing up the garage. Or maybe it was exactly what the company said, a gas leak that made 3 men take off their clothes and walk out into the cold to die. Maybe those footprints I saw were just our own tracks, misidentified in the darkness. Maybe those figures in the trees were just shadows and exhaustion. He paused at the garage door, his hand on the switch. But I don't work in the bush anymore, and I never will again, because I know what I saw, and I know those men didn't just decide to go for a walk. They heard something, or saw something, or felt something that called to them, and they followed it out into the cold. He turned off the light, and we walked back to the house together in silence. My uncle died 5 years ago, but I think about that story sometimes. About the logging camp near Val-d'Or, about the bare footprints circling in the snow, about 3 men who walked out into the deadly cold wearing nothing and never came back. And I wonder what's still out there in those woods. What might still be watching from the tree line when humans venture too deep into places they don't belong. Because the forest remembers, and sometimes it calls. I'd been kayaking the St. Lawrence River near Trois-Rivières for 3 years when I found the island. It was a Sunday in late September 2020, one of those perfect autumn days when the water was calm and the air was crisp and clear. I'd launched from the municipal dock around 9 in the morning, planning to paddle upriver for a few hours before turning back. The St. Lawrence is massive in that section, wide enough that you can paddle for hours without seeing both shores at once. There are dozens of small islands scattered throughout, some inhabited, most not. I'd explored many of them over the years, stopping to eat lunch on rocky shores, walking through stands of old-growth trees, finding the occasional ruins of fishing camps or hunting lodges. I was maybe 10 kilometers upriver from Trois-Rivières when I noticed it. A small island I'd never seen before, sitting maybe 300 meters from the north shore. It was heavily wooded, the trees dense enough that I couldn't see much of the interior from the water. But something about it caught my attention, maybe the way the morning light was hitting it, or maybe just curiosity about why I'd never noticed it before. I paddled closer, circling the island once to get a sense of it. It was roughly oval-shaped, maybe 200 meters long and half that wide. The shoreline was a mix of rocks and sand, with trees growing almost to the water's edge. There was a natural landing spot on the southern end where the shore flattened out, and I beached my kayak there. The island was quiet. Not just the normal quiet of an uninhabited place, but a deeper silence, like sound was being absorbed by the trees and the earth. I could hear the river lapping against the shore behind me, but everything else was muted. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, no wind rustling the leaves. I walked inland, pushing through underbrush that suggested no one had been here in a long time. The trees were old, their trunks thick and gnarled, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves and decomposing vegetation. After maybe 50 meters, I found the first ruin. It was a stone foundation, rectangular, maybe 4 meters by 6 meters. The stones were old and weathered, covered in moss and partially collapsed. Nearby was another foundation, similar size, and beyond that, another. I counted 6 of them total, arranged in a rough line along what might have once been a path or road. At the far end of the settlement, if you could call it that, was a collapsed chimney. The bricks were old, handmade, the mortar crumbling. The chimney had fallen in on itself, creating a pile of rubble surrounded by more stone foundations. I took photos with my phone, documenting the ruins, trying to piece together what kind of settlement this had been. The foundations were too small for anything substantial, maybe fishing cabins or temporary housing, but there was no record of anything like this on the island. I'd studied maps of this section of the river extensively, and this island had never shown up on any of them. I continued exploring, moving toward the center of the island, and that's when I found the cemetery. It was in a small clearing, maybe 30 meters across, surrounded by old trees. There were headstones, rough-cut stone markers, weathered and tilted, arranged in neat rows. I counted 20 of them, all simple and similar in size and shape. I approached the nearest one and examined it. There was no name, just a date carved into the stone, the 7th of November, 1847. I moved to the next headstone. Same thing. The 7th of November, 1847. No name, no epitaph, just that single date. I checked all 20 graves. Every single one had the same date. The 7th of November, 1847. 20 people, all buried on the same day, all anonymous. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. This was wrong. This whole island was wrong. How could 20 people die on the same day and be buried here, on an island that didn't appear on any maps, with no names to mark who they'd been? I took photos of the headstones, of the cemetery, of the clearing. I documented everything I could, feeling increasingly uneasy. The silence of the island was oppressive now, and I had the distinct feeling that I was being watched, that something didn't want me here. I left quickly, returning to my kayak and paddling back to Trois-Rivières. The entire paddle back, I kept looking over my shoulder at the island, watching it recede into the distance. It looked normal enough, just another small wooded island in the street, Lawrence. But I knew better. When I got home, I immediately started researching. The 7th of November, 1847. I found references to cholera outbreaks in Quebec that year, part of a massive epidemic that had swept through Canada in the 1840s, brought by Irish immigrants fleeing the potato famine. Tens of thousands of people had died, many of them in quarantine stations along the St. Lawrence River. The most famous quarantine station was Grosse Île, downriver near Quebec City. But there had been others, temporary camps and stations set up along the river to isolate the sick from the healthy. Many of these camps were poorly documented, and thousands of immigrants had died and been buried in unmarked graves. I found a reference in an old parish record to a cholera outbreak near Trois-Rivières in November 1847. 43 Irish immigrants had died over the course of a week, but there was no mention of where they'd been buried. I tried to find the island on maps. Modern maps, historical maps, aerial photographs, satellite imagery, nothing. There was no island in that location, not on any map I could find. According to every official record, the spot where I'd landed my kayak was just open water. I became obsessed. I spent hours poring over old documents, searching for any mention of a quarantine camp or burial ground near Trois-Rivières. I found scattered references to cholera deaths, to immigrant suffering, to hasty burials, but nothing concrete about an island. A week later, I went back. I launched from the same dock, paddled the same route upriver. I had my GPS this time, the exact coordinates saved from my first visit. I paddled to the spot where the island should have been. There was nothing there. Just open water, the river flowing past, the north shore visible in the distance. I checked my GPS 3 times, confirmed I was in the right location, but there was no island. I spent 3 hours searching. I paddled in expanding circles, checking and rechecking my coordinates, looking for any sign of the island I'd visited just a week earlier. Nothing. I went back the next day, and the day after that, same result. The island was gone. I tried to convince myself I'd been mistaken about the location, that I'd misremembered the coordinates, that I'd somehow gotten confused. But I had photos on my phone, the ruins, the cemetery, the headstones with their single repeated date. I showed the photos to other kayakers, to local historians, to anyone who might help me understand what I'd seen. Most people thought I'd visited one of the other islands in the area and gotten confused about which one. But none of the known islands matched what I'd photographed. A local historian looked at my photos of the headstones and confirmed the date was significant. November 1847 was one of the worst months of the cholera epidemic, she said. Hundreds of Irish immigrants died that month. Many were buried in mass graves, unmarked, forgotten. If you found a cemetery from that period, it's historically significant. But when I tried to show her where the island was, we couldn't find it. It simply wasn't there. I stopped kayaking the St. Lawrence after that. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to see, that I'd stumbled onto a place that existed outside of normal geography, outside of normal time. I still have the photos. I look at them sometimes, studying the weathered headstones, the moss-covered foundations, the collapsed chimney, all evidence of a place that was there and then wasn't. I've developed a theory, though I know how it sounds. I think the island appears and disappears. I think it exists in some liminal space, visible only at certain times or to certain people. Maybe it's anchored to a specific date, November 7th, the anniversary of those deaths. Maybe it appears to people who need to see it, who need to know that those 43 Irish immigrants, dying of cholera far from home, weren't completely forgotten. Or maybe I'm just losing my mind. Maybe I kayaked to some other island, took those photos, and then got confused about where I'd been. Maybe the island is there, solid and real, and I just can't find it again. But I dream about it sometimes. I'm standing in that silent cemetery, surrounded by those 20 headstones. I know there were 20, not 43, and that discrepancy bothers me. And I can hear voices, singing in Irish Gaelic, a language I don't speak but somehow understand in the dream. They're singing about home, about green hills and families left behind, about dying in a strange land and being buried without names. In the dream, I try to write their names on the headstones. I have a chisel and I'm carving into the stone, trying to give them back their identities. But every time I finish one name and move to the next headstone, the previous one is blank again. The stone won't hold the names. It only holds the date, the 7th of November, 1847. I wake up from these dreams with a profound sense of sadness and loss. 20 people, or 43, or however many are really buried there, died in isolation, were buried without ceremony, and have been forgotten by history. Their graves exist on an island that appears and disappears, that can't be found on maps, that may not even be real in any conventional sense. And I'm the only person who knows they're there, the only person who's seen those graves, who's walked through that silent cemetery, who's documented their existence. Sometimes I think I should try harder to find the island again, mount a proper expedition, bring other people, search systematically until we locate it, bring those graves back into the historical record, give those people the acknowledgement they deserve. But another part of me is afraid that if I found the island again, I might not be able to leave, afraid that the island appears to people for a reason, that it wants something from those who find it, afraid that one day I'll be kayaking the St. Lawrence and I'll see that familiar wooded shore, and I'll land my kayak on those rocks, and I'll walk inland to that cemetery. And this time, there will be 21 headstones instead of 20. And the newest one will have a different date. Today's date, with my name carved beneath it. So I stay away from the St. Lawrence now. I've taken up hiking instead, keeping my adventures on solid ground where the terrain doesn't shift and disappear. But sometimes, on November 7th, I think about that island. I think about those 20 graves, all marked with the same date, and I wonder if the island is visible on that day, the anniversary of whatever happened there. I wonder if someone else might find it, might walk through that silent cemetery and see those headstones. And I wonder if they'll count the graves carefully, if they'll notice whether there are 20 or 21, because I'm not sure anymore. I'm not sure how many there were when I was there. Memory is a tricky thing, especially when you're trying to remember something that might not have been real to begin with. All I know for certain is that somewhere in the St. Lawrence River, in a place that exists and doesn't exist, there's an island with a cemetery. And on that island, people are buried who died far from home, who were forgotten by history, who wait in that silent place for someone to remember them. I remembered them. I saw them. I documented them. And I'm terrified that was exactly what they were waiting for. I was working for an environmental consulting firm in the summer of 2017 when we got the contract to assess the old Noranda copper mine near ruined Noranda. The mine had been closed since 1968, left to slowly flood and deteriorate for nearly 50 years. Now a company was considering reopening it, and they needed us to test for heavy metal contamination, structural integrity, and various environmental hazards before they could proceed. The job was supposed to take 3 weeks. We'd sample water from the flooded lower levels, test the air quality in the accessible tunnels, and document the overall condition of the infrastructure. It was routine work, the kind of thing our firm did regularly at abandoned industrial sites across Quebec. I was paired with Dennis, a senior environmental technician who'd been doing this kind of work for 20 years. He'd been in dozens of abandoned mines, had dealt with every hazard you could imagine: toxic gases, unstable ceilings, flooded shafts. He was thorough, cautious, exactly the kind of person you wanted beside you when you were descending into darkness beneath the earth. The mine entrance was on the outskirts of Noranda, a concrete structure built into the side of a hill. The heavy steel door had been sealed when the mine closed, but the company planning the reopening had cut through the locks and chains for us. Inside was a loading area, the floor still covered with the detritus of the mine's final days: rusted tools, broken equipment, paperwork yellowed with age. We spent the first week working in the upper levels, areas that were relatively accessible and safe. The mine had been excavated in a series of levels, each one descending deeper into the earth, connected by vertical shafts and sloping ramps. The upper levels were dry and stable, though everything was covered in rust and dust and the slow decay of abandonment. By the second week, we needed to go deeper. The company wanted samples from the lower levels, the areas that had been most productive before the mine's closure. These sections were partially flooded, the water table having risen over the decades, and accessing them required careful planning and safety equipment. Dennis and I descended on a Tuesday morning. We took the main shaft down, using a portable winch system that the company had installed for us. The shaft dropped straight down into darkness, the walls rough-cut rock punctuated by the occasional timber support beam. Our headlamps illuminated maybe 10 meters ahead, showing only rock and shadows and the slow descent into the Earth's interior. We stopped at level 7, approximately 300 meters below the surface. The air here was cool and damp, carrying that mineral smell that pervades old mines, a mix of copper, sulfur, and wet stone. The tunnel branched off from the shaft in multiple directions, and we consulted our map to figure out which route to take. "We need to go east," Denny said, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "There should be a junction about 200 meters down that tunnel, and we can take samples from the pools there." We started walking, our boots squelching in the shallow water that covered the tunnel floor. The ceiling was low here, maybe 2 meters high, supported by wooden beams that had somehow survived 50 years of moisture and darkness. Our headlamps created shifting shadows as we moved, making the tunnel seem to contract and expand around us. We'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes when we heard it. Voices, distant at first, barely audible over the sound of our footsteps and breathing, but definitely voices, multiple men talking, their words indistinct but their tone conversational, casual. Dennis stopped walking. "Do you hear that?" I nodded, turning my head to try to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. "There's someone else down here?" "There shouldn't be. We're the only ones cleared for access." We stood still, listening. The voices continued, and now I could hear other sounds beneath them: the clang of metal on stone, the rumble of something heavy being moved, echoes of industrial work. "It's coming from ahead," Dennis said, starting forward again, his pace quicker now. We followed the tunnel for another 50 meters, until we reached a section where the passageway was blocked. A concrete barrier had been installed, floor to ceiling, sealing off the tunnel that continued beyond it. There was a metal plaque bolted to the concrete, weathered but still legible. "Danger, section scellé, défense d'entrée. Danger, sealed section, do not enter." And the voices were coming from the other side. We pressed our ears against the barrier. The concrete was cold and slightly damp, and through it we could hear them clearly. Men speaking in French, their voices carrying the particular accent of northern Quebec. They were talking about work, about quotas and shifts and equipment, casual workplace conversation, and beneath their voices, we could hear the sounds of mining, the rhythmic clang of pickaxes striking stone, the rumble and scrape of ore carts moving on rails. The occasional shout as someone called out a warning or instruction. "There's no way," Dennis whispered. "There's no one on the other side. That section has been sealed for 55 years. I knew the history. The collapse in 1962 had been catastrophic. A poorly supported ceiling had given way, bringing down tons of rock and sealing off an entire section of the mine. 17 men had been working in that section. None of them made it out. The mine company had deemed recovery too dangerous and expensive, so they'd sealed the area and left the bodies entombed in the darkness. But we were hearing voices. We were hearing the sound of men working, clear as day, coming from a section that should have been silent and empty, except for the bones of miners who died before I was born. Dennis pulled away from the barrier, his face pale in the glow of my headlamp. "We need to report this immediately. If someone has broken through the seal, if people are working in there without authorization—" "Dennis," I interrupted, "listen." We stood in silence, and I counted the voices. I could distinguish maybe 8 or 9 different men, all speaking in overlapping conversations. And the sound of work, not just 1 or 2 pickaxes, but many, creating a rhythm of industrial labor that echoed through the sealed tunnel. "There are too many," I said. "If someone broke through the seal, if they were mining illegally, they wouldn't have that many people down here, and they wouldn't be making that much noise." Denny didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at the barrier, his breathing quick and shallow. I pressed my ear against the concrete again, listening more carefully. The voices were speaking in French, but the vocabulary was slightly off, slightly old-fashioned. The phrases they used, the way they structured their sentences, it sounded like the French of decades past, the way my grandparents' generation spoke. And I realized something else. The sounds of work, the pickaxes, the ore carts, the shouts, they had a repetitive quality. The same sounds occurring in the same patterns, over and over, like a recording on loop. "We need to leave," I said, pulling away from the barrier. "We need to get out of here now." Dennis didn't argue. We turned and walked quickly back the way we'd come, our headlamps bobbing as we hurried through the tunnel. Behind us, the sounds continued, voices and laughter, and the endless clang of pickaxes against stone. We didn't speak until we were back at the main shaft, beginning our ascent to the surface. Even then, Dennis just shook his head when I tried to bring it up, his face set in an expression of determined denial. When we reached the surface, we went straight to our supervisor and reported what we'd heard. She listened skeptically, clearly thinking we'd been affected by the confined space or bad air, but she agreed to send another team down to verify. The second team went down the next day. 2 different technicians, both experienced with mine work. They descended to level 7, walked to the sealed section, and spent 30 minutes listening at the barrier. They reported hearing nothing, just the natural sounds of water dripping and distance settling, the kind of ambient noise you'd expect in an abandoned mine. But I know what I heard. Dennis knows what he heard. We heard 17 men who died in 1962, trapped when the ceiling came down, entombed in darkness and left to suffocate in the gradually thinning air. We heard them still working, still calling out to each other, still striking at the rock with their pickaxes, trying to dig their way out of a tomb that was sealed from the outside. Denny quit the next week, said he was retiring early, that he'd had enough of confined spaces and underground work. I finished the contract, but I refused to go back down to level 7. I did all my remaining work in the upper levels, and I was grateful when the 3 weeks were up and I could leave that mine behind. The company decided not to reopen the mine. The official reason was that the cost of dewatering and rehabilitating the lower levels was too high. But I wonder if our report played a role. I wonder if they sent their own people down, if they heard what Dennis and I heard, if they realized that some places are better left sealed and forgotten. I still work in environmental assessment, but I avoid mine projects now. I stick to surface work, to places where the sun reaches and the air circulates freely. I can't handle the thought of descending into darkness again, of hearing sounds that shouldn't exist, of pressing my ear against barriers and listening to the voices of the dead. Because I know they're still down there. Level 7, sealed tunnel, 300 meters beneath Rwanda. 17 men who died when the ceiling came down, who were abandoned by the company that employed them, who were left to rot in the darkness. And they're still working, still following the routines of their final shift, still calling out to each other, still swinging their pickaxes, still moving ore carts on rails that must have long since rusted away to nothing. Sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I hear it. The distant clang of pickaxes on stone, echoing up from depths that shouldn't be able to reach me. The sound of ore carts rumbling, of men laughing, of work that never ends. I tell myself it's just memory, just my brain replaying what I heard that day. But I know better. I know that sound carries through earth and rock in ways we don't fully understand. I know that what happened in that mine in 1962 created an echo that still reverberates, that those 17 men are still trying to complete their shift, still trying to dig their way back to the surface and the lives they left behind. And I know that barriers and seals and 50 years of abandonment can't silence the sounds of men who died doing the work they were paid to do, whose bodies were deemed too expensive to recover, who were left to become part of the mine itself. The earth holds its dead. And sometimes, in the deepest places, in the sealed tunnels and collapsed shafts, the dead continue their work. Still mining, still calling out, still waiting for someone to hear them, and understand that they never left, that they're still there, still trying to find their way home through darkness and stone and the impossible weight of the earth above. I booked a room at the converted convent in Kamouraska for a long weekend in early November 2019. I'd been working too much, feeling burned out from my job in Montreal, and I wanted to get away somewhere quiet, somewhere with history and character. The bed and breakfast had excellent reviews, and the photos showed a beautiful stone building overlooking the St. Lawrence River, the kind of place where you could disconnect and recharge. The drive from Montreal took about 4 hours, the landscape gradually transforming from urban sprawl to farmland to the rugged beauty of the lower St. Lawrence region. Kamouraska itself was a small village, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, where life moves at a different pace than in the city. The convent sat on a hill overlooking the village and the river beyond, a massive stone structure that had been built in 1847 and served as home to an order of Augustinian nuns for over 150 years. I arrived in the late afternoon, the November sun already low on the horizon. The owners, a couple in their 60s named Claude and Marguerite, greeted me warmly and showed me around. They'd purchased the building in 2005 after the last of the nuns had either died or moved to other facilities, and they'd spent years carefully converting it into a bed and breakfast while preserving as much of the original architecture as possible. The building has such history, Marguerite explained as we climbed the wide central staircase. We wanted to honor that, to let guests experience what it was like when the sisters lived here. My room was on the 3rd floor, in what had been the nuns' dormitory. The hallway was long and straight, with rooms on both sides, small cells that had been the sisters' individual chambers. Mine was at the far end, a simple space with white plaster walls, a narrow bed, a wooden crucifix above the headboard, and a single window that looked out over the river. The sisters lived very simply, Claude said, standing in the doorway. We've tried to keep that spirit while making the rooms comfortable for guests. There's a private bathroom that we added, but otherwise, this is much as it would have been. I settled in, unpacking my few belongings and enjoying the peace and quiet. The building was nearly empty, just one other couple staying on the 2nd floor. November was the off-season, and I was grateful for the solitude. Dinner was served in what had been the convent's refectory, a large room with high ceilings and long wooden tables. Marguerite had prepared a traditional Quebec meal, tourtière, vegetables from their garden, homemade bread. She and Claude joined me and the other couple, and we talked about the building's history. How many nuns lived here? I asked. At its peak, maybe 60, Claude said, but that was in the early 1900s. By the time it closed in 2003, there were only 12 left, all of them elderly. Did any of them die here? Marguerite nodded. Many. The sisters who joined the order typically stayed for life. There's a cemetery behind the building, over 100 graves, all nuns who lived and died in this convent. After dinner, I returned to my room. It was only 8 o'clock, but the darkness and quiet made it feel later. I read for a while, then turned off the light and went to sleep, lulled by the absolute silence of the old building. I woke suddenly at 2:47 a.m. I know because I checked my phone immediately, trying to figure out what had pulled me from sleep. The room was dark except for the faint moonlight coming through the window, and I could hear singing. Women's voices, multiple voices, chanting in harmony. Latin, I recognized it as Latin even though I didn't understand the words, the particular rhythm and cadence of liturgical prayer. At first, I thought it was a recording, some kind of atmospheric touch that the owners had installed to enhance the experience. But as I became more fully awake, I realized the sound was coming from the hallway outside my room, not from speakers. I got out of bed and moved to the door, pressing my ear against it. The chanting was clear, getting louder, like it was moving closer. I could distinguish individual voices now, some low and solemn, others higher and more melodic. All of them perfectly synchronized, reciting what must have been prayers they'd memorized through years of repetition. I opened the door slowly, quietly, and looked out into the hallway. They were there. A procession of women in black habits, walking in single file down the center of the corridor. I counted 12 of them, moving slowly and deliberately, their heads slightly bowed, their hands clasped in front of them. Their lips were moving in prayer, the source of the chanting I'd heard. I stepped back instinctively, my hand still on the doorknob, leaving the door open just a crack so I could watch. The women continued their procession, moving past my room without acknowledging my presence. They made no sound except for their voices. Their footsteps were completely silent on the old wooden floors. Their habits didn't rustle. They didn't breathe loud enough to hear. As they passed, I could see their faces in profile. Old faces, worn and lined with age, but peaceful. Their eyes were closed or downcast, their expressions serene. They looked real, solid, as corporeal as I was. But something about them was wrong. The way they moved was too smooth, too synchronized, like they were gliding rather than walking. The last nun in the procession was smaller than the others, more frail, her habit hanging loose on a thin frame. As she passed my door, she turned her head slightly and looked directly at me. Her eyes were open, clouded with cataracts, unfocused, but definitely looking in my direction. Her lips continued moving in prayer, but I saw a flicker of recognition, an acknowledgement that she knew I was there, watching her. Then she turned away and continued following the others. The procession reached the end of the hallway, where the corridor terminated at a large window overlooking the river. I expected them to turn around, to come back down the hall, but instead they simply faded. One by one, starting with the woman in front, they became transparent, then translucent, then vanished entirely, like morning mist burning away in sunlight. Within seconds, they were all gone. The hallway was empty, silent, just an ordinary corridor in an old building. I stood in my doorway for a long time, my heart pounding, trying to process what I'd just seen. Every rational part of my brain told me I'd been dreaming, that I'd experienced some kind of hypnagogic hallucination, but I was awake. I was certain I was awake, and what I'd seen had been too detailed, too specific, too real to be a dream. I went back to bed but didn't sleep. I lay there until dawn, listening to the old building settle and creak around me, jumping at every small sound. At breakfast, I was alone. The other couple had checked out early to make a ferry. Marguerite served me coffee and croissants, and I tried to decide whether to mention what I'd seen. "Did you sleep well?" she asked, in that polite way hosts do. I hesitated, then decided to be honest. I woke up around 3. I heard singing, chanting in Latin. Her expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted, a kind of knowing sadness. "And did you see them?" "The nuns, walking down the hallway." She sat down across from me, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "You're not the first guest to see them, not even the first this month." "Are they? I mean, what are they?" "The sisters," she said simply. "The nuns who lived here for over a century. Many of them died in this building, and some of them, it seems, never really left." She explained that the sisters had followed a strict routine, prayers at specific hours throughout the day and night, processions through the hallways, devotions in the chapel. Even after death, some of them seemed to continue these routines. "The procession you saw was probably Matins," Marguerite continued. "One of the night prayers. The sisters would wake at 2:30 a.m. every morning to pray. That schedule was sacred to them for generations." "But why can I see them? Why do they appear?" She shrugged. "We don't know. Some guests see them, some don't. Some hear the chanting but see nothing. Some experience nothing at all. Claude thinks it has to do with sensitivity, that some people are more attuned to. Whatever it is that lingers here. Are you afraid of them?" "No," she said, and she sounded sincere. "They're harmless. They're just continuing their prayers, their devotions. This building was their home for decades, some of them for their entire adult lives. Why wouldn't they stay?" I checked out that afternoon, earlier than I'd planned. Not because I was frightened, though I was, but because I couldn't shake the image of that last nun turning to look at me, her clouded eyes somehow seeing me despite their blindness. I've thought about that weekend many times since, about those 12 women in black habits, walking silently down a hallway in the dead of night, maintaining a prayer schedule they'd followed for decades, about the way they'd simply faded away when they reached the end of the corridor, disappearing into whatever space they occupied when they weren't visible. I've tried to research the convent's history to find out who those nuns might have been. Records show that the last 12 sisters left the building in 2003. Some moved to other convents, some to nursing homes. Several died within a year of leaving, their advanced age finally catching up with them once they were removed from the place that had sustained them. I wonder if those were the 12 I saw, the last inhabitants of the convent, somehow imprinted on the building, still walking their appointed rounds even after death had released them from their vows. Or maybe they were sisters from earlier generations, women who died in the building over the course of a century and a half. Maybe what I saw was a procession that had been walking that hallway for decades, a prayer service that had been repeated so many thousands of times that it had become permanent, etched into the very fabric of the building. I've considered going back. Part of me wants to spend another night in that third-floor room, to wait for 2:30 a.m. and see if they appear again. Part of me wants to understand what I saw, to make sense of the impossible, but I haven't gone back. Because something about that experience disturbed me on a level I can't fully articulate. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was something deeper, a recognition that the boundary between life and death is more permeable than we like to believe, that some people's routines and devotions are so deeply ingrained that they continue even after the body that performed them has failed. Those nuns gave their entire lives to prayer and service. They followed the same schedule day after day, year after year, decade after decade. They lived simply, prayed constantly, and when they died, they were buried in the cemetery behind the building that had been their entire world. And some part of them stayed, some echo or residue or fragment of consciousness that still walks those hallways, still recites those prayers, still maintains the routines that define their existence. I don't know if they're aware. I don't know if the nun who looked at me actually saw me, or if her turning was just part of the pattern, a movement repeated so many times it had become automatic. I don't know if they're suffering or at peace, if they're trapped, or if they choose to remain. All I know is that in a converted convent in Kamouraska, on the third floor where the sisters once slept, there's a procession that walks at 2:30 a.m. 12 women in black habits, praying in Latin, moving silently down a hallway that was their home. And they'll keep walking, keep praying, keep maintaining their vigil long after the bed and breakfast closes, long after the building itself crumbles to ruins. Because some devotions are eternal, some routines outlast the flesh that performed them, and some prayers never end. I was driving through the Laurentians on a Thursday night in March, heading back to Montreal after a long day visiting clients in Mont-Tremblant. I'd left later than I'd intended, and it was already past 11 when I merged onto Route 117 South. The highway was nearly empty, just the occasional transport truck heading in the opposite direction, their headlights briefly illuminating the dense forest on either side of the road. I was tired, fighting to keep my eyes open, and I turned on the radio to help me stay alert. I started scanning through the FM stations, looking for something with enough energy to keep me awake. Most of what I found was static or weak signals from Montreal stations that faded in and out as I drove through the valleys and hills of the Laurentians. I was somewhere between Saint-Agathe-des-Monts and Saint Jérôme when I stumbled onto it. The frequency was 94.7 FM, a spot on the dial that should have been empty. There was no licensed station broadcasting on that frequency in that area. But when I tuned to it, I heard a voice, clear and strong, no static, no interference. A man speaking in French, his tone flat and emotionless, like a computer-generated voice or someone reading from a script with no inflection. At first, I thought it was some kind of emergency broadcast or public service announcement, but as I listened, I realized it was something stranger. The man was reading names, just names, one after another, with numbers interspersed between them. Lemieux, Jean-Paul, 47 à 293, Beauchamp, Marie-Claire, 52 à 718, Gagnon, Robert, 39 à 440, et 1. On and on, in that same monotone voice, with no pauses, except for brief breaths between entries. No explanation of what the names meant or what the numbers represented. Just an endless recitation, like someone working through a list. I drove for maybe 20 minutes, listening to this bizarre broadcast. The voice never changed tone, never added any context. Occasionally, there would be a longer pause, as if the reader was turning a page or checking their notes, but then the recitation would continue. Tremblay, Sophie, 28 à 156. Bouchard, Luc, 60, et 1 à 892. Dufresne, Catherine, 19 à 447. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was some kind of memorial service being broadcast, reading the names of people who died. But why broadcast it on an unlicensed frequency in the middle of the night? And what did the numbers mean? As I got closer to Montreal, I expected the signal to fade or be replaced by something else, but it stayed strong, that voice continuing its litany of names and numbers, never stopping, never varying. I pulled out my phone and started recording, holding it near the car's speaker. I didn't know why, maybe just to have proof that I'd actually heard this, that I wasn't imagining it. By the time I reached the outskirts of Montreal, I'd recorded maybe 10 minutes of the broadcast. Then, as I entered the more densely populated areas of the city, the signal finally began to fade. Within a few minutes, it was gone, replaced by static. When I got home around 1 in the morning, I was exhausted but too curious to sleep. I pulled up the recording on my phone and played it back, listening more carefully to the names being read. Some of them sounded familiar, not people I knew personally, but names I'd heard in the news or read in newspapers. I started writing them down, then searching for them online. Lemieux Jean-Paul brought up a news article from 2015 about a man from Trois-Rivières who'd been killed in a hunting accident. The article gave his age as 47. Beauchamp Marie Claire led me to an obituary from 2018, a woman from Sherbrooke who died of cancer at age 52. Gagnon Robert had been a victim of a car accident near Quebec City in 2019, age 39. The numbers following each name were their ages when they died. I felt a chill run down my spine. I kept searching, checking every name I'd written down. All of them were dead. All of them had died in Quebec, some in accidents, some from illness, some from violence. The dates of death varied, spanning several years, but they were all dead. I listened to the entire recording again, this time writing down every name, 43 names in total over the course of 10 minutes. I spent the next 2 hours researching them. I found information on 38 of them, all deceased, all from Quebec, all with ages that matched the numbers on the broadcast. The other 5 names I couldn't find anything. Either they were people whose deaths hadn't been reported publicly, or they were mistakes in my transcription, or they were people who would die in the future. That last thought made my blood run cold. I tried to sleep but couldn't. At 4 in the morning, I gave up and went back to my computer, searching for any information about broadcasts on 94.7 FM in the Laurentians. Nothing. The frequency was unlicensed, unused. There should have been nothing there. I checked forums and message boards where people discussed radio phenomena, number stations, mysterious broadcasts. I found nothing that matched what I'd heard. Over the next few days, I became obsessed. I researched the names on my list more thoroughly, building a database of who they were, when, and how they died. I looked for patterns, connections that might explain why these specific people's names were being read on this mysterious broadcast. I found nothing connecting them except that they were all dead and all from Quebec. The following Thursday, exactly 1 week later, I drove the same route at the same time. I left Montreal around 10 p.m. and headed north on Route 117, my radio tuned to 94.7 FM. Static, nothing but static. I drove all the way to Mont-Tremblant and back, scanning the dial constantly, checking 94.7 every few minutes. I never picked up the broadcast again. I tried different routes through the Laurentians over the next few weeks. Different times, different roads, always scanning for that frequency. I never found it. But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving, I'll catch fragments of it on different frequencies. Just for a few seconds, a voice reading a name, a number, then static. Never long enough to record. Never on the same frequency twice. Nadeau, François, 56 à 881. Then nothing. Or I'll be scanning through stations and I'll hear it for just a moment before it fades. Pelletier, N, 224. And it's gone. I started keeping a notebook in my car, writing down every fragment I caught. Over the course of 6 months, I collected maybe 20 additional names. I researched all of them, all dead, all from Quebec. Some of them had died years ago, some more recently, and three of them hadn't died yet. I found those 3 names in current phone directories, social media, public records. They were alive, living normal lives in different parts of Quebec, completely unaware that their names and ages were being broadcast on phantom radio frequencies. I tried to warn them. I called one of them, a woman named Isabelle Fortin, age 41. I explained what I'd heard, tried to tell her she needed to be careful, that something terrible might happen to her. She thought I was crazy, threatened to call the police if I contacted her again. I didn't blame her. I sounded insane even to myself. 2 months later, Isabelle Fortin died in a house fire, age 41, the number that had been read after her name on the broadcast. I checked on the other 2 names. One of them, Michel LeBlanc, age 58, had died in a workplace accident 3 weeks after I'd first heard his name on the broadcast. The third person, whose name I'd heard most recently, was still alive as far as I could tell, but I monitor the obituaries obsessively now, waiting to see if they'll appear. I've stopped trying to find the broadcast intentionally. The obsession was destroying my life. I wasn't sleeping, wasn't focusing on work, was spending every free moment either driving through the Laurentians or researching names of dead people. But I still hear it sometimes. Those fragments that break through the static, just for a moment. A name, an age, then silence. And I've started to wonder what it is. What's generating this broadcast? Is it some kind of memorial, a tribute to the dead broadcast from nowhere? Is it a warning system, reading the names of people who will die, cataloging future deaths? Or is it something else entirely? Something that exists outside our normal understanding of reality, some kind of accounting system for souls, a cosmic record keeper noting each death as it occurs. I've developed a theory, though I have no way to prove it. I think the broadcast is always happening, always reading names, always cataloging deaths, but it exists on a frequency that's usually inaccessible to normal radios. Occasionally, under specific conditions, certain locations, certain times, certain atmospheric conditions, it bleeds through into our reality. For just a few minutes or a few seconds, we can hear it. We can hear the endless recitation of the dead. And sometimes, if we're unlucky or unfortunate enough, we hear names of people who aren't dead yet, people who are marked, whose names are already on the list even though their deaths haven't occurred. I think about those 5 names I couldn't find information about when I first heard the broadcast, the ones I couldn't verify as dead. I wonder if they were people who would die in the future, whose names were being read in advance of their deaths. I wonder if somewhere, someone heard my name on that broadcast. If my name and age are being read in that flat, emotionless voice on a frequency I'll never find, marking me for a death that hasn't happened yet. I've become hyper-aware of my own mortality since that night. Every time I get in a car, every time I cross a street, every time I feel a pain in my chest or a moment of dizziness, I wonder if this is it. If this is the moment that makes my appearance on the broadcast make sense. I still drive through the Laurentians sometimes, though not as often, and I still keep my radio scanning, still listen for fragments of that voice, reading its endless list. Because I need to know. I need to understand what I heard, what it means, why it exists. But mostly, I need to know if I'll hear my own name before it's too late. If I'll get that warning, that confirmation that I'm on the list. Because the broadcast is still out there, still reading names, still cataloging the dead and the soon-to-be dead in that flat, emotionless voice. Somewhere in the static between stations, in the empty frequencies where nothing should exist, it continues. Reading names, recording numbers, marking death after death after death in an endless litany that never stops. And sometimes, if you're driving through the Laurentians late at night, if you scan to just the right frequency at just the right moment, you'll hear it too. A voice from nowhere, reading names you might recognize, names of people who died, or names of people who will. And you'll have to decide whether to keep listening, whether to write down what you hear, whether to try to warn people whose names haven't been crossed off yet, or whether to turn off the radio, to pretend you never heard it, to go on living as if death isn't being cataloged on frequencies we're not meant to access. I made my choice. I keep listening, because someone needs to bear witness. Someone needs to acknowledge these names being read into the void. Even if that someone is just me, driving through the dark, listening to the roll call of the dead, waiting to hear if my name will be next. I started house hunting in Sherbrooke in October 2021, looking for something with character that I could afford on my teacher's salary. I'd been working at a high school in the Eastern Townships for 3 years, renting an apartment downtown, and I was ready to own something, to put down roots. My realtor was a woman named Diane, maybe in her late 50s, who'd been selling houses in Sherbrooke for 30 years. She knew the market, knew which neighborhoods were appreciating, knew which houses had problems hidden behind fresh paint. I trusted her judgment. We'd looked at maybe a dozen properties over 2 weekends, mostly modest bungalows and semi-detached houses in my price range. Nothing had felt right. Either they needed too much work, or they were in neighborhoods I didn't like, or they just didn't speak to me. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, Diane called me. "I have something interesting," she said. "A Victorian on Rue Wellington. Just came on the market. The price is, well, it's surprisingly low for what it is. I think you should see it." She emailed me the listing. The photos showed a stunning 3-story Victorian house with ornate gingerbread trim, a wraparound porch, and large bay windows. The exterior was painted in shades of cream and burgundy, the colors that were authentic to that era. The interior shots showed high ceilings, elaborate moldings, hardwood floors, and period details that looked immaculate. The price was listed at $185,000, absurdly low for a house that size in decent condition. Similar Victorians in Sherbrooke were selling for 3 or 4 times that amount. "What's wrong with it?" I asked when I called Diane back. "That's what I want to find out," she said. "Can you meet me there tomorrow at 2? I took a half day from work and met Diane at the address the next afternoon. Rue Wellington was a quiet street in an older part of Sherbrooke, lined with mature trees and a mix of architectural styles. I found the address easily, 1247 Rue Wellington. And there it was, exactly as it had appeared in the photos. A beautiful Victorian house, 3 stories tall, with the wraparound porch and ornate woodwork. The yard was overgrown, the grass unmowed and leaves piled against the foundation, but the house itself looked structurally sound. Diane was already there, standing on the sidewalk with her tablet, checking the listing details. She smiled when she saw me. "It's something, isn't it?" she said. "I drove by this morning to make sure it was real. The owner is highly motivated, needs to sell quickly. Hence the price." "Why are they selling?" "Estate sale. The previous owner died, no heirs. The executor wants to liquidate everything quickly." We walked up the porch steps. The wood was solid under our feet, no rot or sagging. Diane unlocked the front door with a key from a lockbox, and we stepped inside. The interior was even more impressive than the photos. The entry hall had elaborate wainscoting, a grand staircase with a polished oak banister, and a chandelier that looked original to the house. The floors were hardwood, gleaming as if freshly polished. "This is incredible," I said, looking around. "At this price?" "I know. Let's see the rest." We toured the ground floor, a living room with a fireplace and built-in bookcases, a dining room with a bay window seat, a butler's pantry, and a kitchen that had been updated sometime in what looked like the 1940s. Everything was furnished, overstuffed chairs, Persian rugs, china in the cabinets, but covered in a fine layer of dust, like no one had been there in weeks or months. "Will the furniture stay?" I asked. Diane checked her tablet. "The listing says it's being sold furnished. Everything stays unless you specifically don't want something." We climbed to the second floor, where there were 4 bedrooms and a bathroom with an original clawfoot tub. The third floor was a finished attic, likely added later, with sloped ceilings and dormers. I was falling in love with the house. It had character, history, the kind of architectural details you couldn't get in new construction. And at $185,000, even accounting for whatever work it might need, it was an incredible deal. We were on the second floor, in what would have been the master bedroom, when I noticed something odd. "Diane, are there no electrical outlets?" She looked around the room. "What do you mean?" "Look at the walls. There are no outlets, no light switches either." She frowned, examining the walls more closely. "That's strange. Maybe they're hidden, behind furniture?" We started moving furniture, checking behind dressers and nightstands. No outlets, no switches. The room was lit by natural light from the large windows, but there were no visible electrical fixtures at all. We checked the other bedrooms. Same thing. No outlets, no switches, no visible wiring. Maybe it's not wired for electricity? I suggested. Maybe it's still gas lighting, but there were no gas fixtures either. No pipes visible, no lamp connections, just bare walls. We went back downstairs and checked more carefully. The kitchen had what looked like a 1940s refrigerator and stove, but when I examined them more closely, they weren't connected to anything. They were just there, decorative, non-functional. The more I looked, the stranger everything seemed. The furniture was period appropriate and appeared well maintained, but there were no modern touches anywhere. No light switches, no outlets, no phone jacks or cable connections. The bathroom had plumbing fixtures, but when I turned the tap, nothing came out. This doesn't make sense, I said. How did anyone live here? Diane was checking her tablet, scrolling through the listing details, her brow furrowed. The listing says it's habitable. It says all systems are functional, but they're not. There's no electricity. The water doesn't work. She looked genuinely confused, like she'd never noticed these details before. We should check with the listing agent. There might be something I'm missing. We left the house, Diane locking the door behind us. Standing on the porch, I looked back through the windows. The interior looked perfect, inviting, like a home waiting for someone to move in. I still want it, I said. Even if it needs to be completely rewired and replumbed. At that price, I could afford to do the work. Let me contact the listing agent and get clarification on the systems, Diane said. I'll call you tonight. She did call that night, and we agreed to go back the next day with a building inspector, a retired contractor who did inspection work and who Diane trusted. We scheduled it for 2 p.m. I could barely sleep that night, my mind full of plans for the house. I'd modernize it carefully, keeping the character while adding necessary amenities. I could see myself living there, teaching at the school, and coming home to that beautiful Victorian every evening. The next day, I left work early again and drove to Rue Wellington, arriving a few minutes before 2. Diane's car was already there, parked on the street. She was standing on the sidewalk, staring at something. I parked and got out, walking over to where she stood. "Where's the house?" I asked. She turned to look at me, her face pale. "What house?" I looked at the address marker 1247 Rue Wellington. But where the Victorian house had stood yesterday, there was just an empty lot. Overgrown grass, a few scraggly trees, some old foundation stones partially hidden in the weeds. "This isn't funny," I said. "Where's the house? Did someone tear it down overnight?" "There was never a house here," Diane said quietly. "I checked my records. 1247 Rue Wellington doesn't exist. The addresses go from 1245 to 1249. There's no 1247. That's impossible. We were inside it yesterday. You unlocked the door. We toured all 3 floors." She shook her head. "I don't remember that. I don't have any listing for a house at this address." I pulled out my phone. I took photos. "Look." I opened my photo gallery and scrolled to yesterday. The photos were there. The Victorian house, the ornate exterior, the interior rooms. Proof that we'd been there, that it had existed. I showed them to Diane. She stared at the screen, her expression unreadable. "That's not possible," she whispered. The building inspector arrived then, a friendly man named Raymond, who'd brought his toolbox and inspection equipment. Diane and I stood there trying to explain the situation, showing him the photos on my phone while standing in front of an empty lot where the house should have been. Raymond walked the lot carefully, examining the ground. "There are old foundation stones here," he said. "Looks like there was a structure at some point, but it's been gone for decades. Look at these trees, they're 30, 40 years old. They've been growing here for a long time." I felt like I was losing my mind. We were inside that house yesterday, both of us. We toured it for an hour. Diane was silent, staring at the empty lot like she could will the house back into existence. Raymond left after a few minutes, clearly thinking we were wasting his time with some kind of prank. Diane and I stood on the sidewalk, not speaking, both of us trying to make sense of what was happening. "I need to go," she finally said. "I need to check my files, my email, everything. There has to be an explanation." She left, and I stayed, standing in front of that empty lot, looking at the photos on my phone. The Victorian house, solid and real, captured in digital images that proved it had existed. I researched the address that night. Property records showed that 1,247 Rue Wellington had existed historically. There had been a house at that address from 1887 until 1957, when it had burned down. The fire had killed the owner, a widow named Margaret Bellingham, who'd lived there alone. The lot had remained empty since then. The city had eventually renumbered the street, eliminating the address entirely so that the numbers jumped from 1245 to 1249. But I had photos of the house. I had memories of walking through it, of examining its rooms, of planning my future there. Over the next few weeks, I drove past that lot regularly. Most of the time, it was just empty land, overgrown and forgotten. But sometimes, just for a moment, just at the edge of my vision, I'd see it. The Victorian house, flickering like a mirage, there and not there, existing in some space between what was and what is. I tried to capture it on camera during those moments, but the house never appeared in photos, only the empty lot. Diane never spoke to me about it again. When I called her to discuss other properties, she was professional but distant. She never mentioned the house on Rue Wellington. And when I tried to bring it up, she'd change the subject or claim not to remember. I eventually bought a different house, a modest bungalow in a newer neighborhood. It's fine, it's home, but I still drive past that empty lot sometimes, and I still see it occasionally, that beautiful Victorian house, frozen in time, appearing for just a moment before fading back into whatever space it occupies. And I wonder about Margaret Bellingham, who died in the fire in 1957. I wonder if she's still there, in that house that exists and doesn't exist, maintaining her home in death as she did in life, keeping the floors polished and the furniture dusted, waiting for someone to appreciate the beauty of what she'd preserved. I wonder if that's why the house appeared to me. If Margaret was looking for someone to see it, to value it, to recognize what it had been. And I wonder if I failed some test by leaving, by not finding a way to stay, by choosing the safety of an empty lot over the mystery of a house that flickered in and out of reality. Because I think the house is still there, still waiting, still appearing to people who might appreciate it, who might be willing to accept the impossibility of it. And someday, someone will see it and not leave. Someone will walk through that door and make it their home, regardless of whether it exists in any conventional sense. And they'll disappear from our reality, living in that beautiful Victorian house, in that space between what is and what was, forever preserved in 1957, before the fire, before the loss, before time erased it from the world. But I'll still be here, driving past an empty lot, catching glimpses of a house that shouldn't exist, wondering what I gave up when I chose reality over impossibility, wondering if I made the right choice, or if I walked away from the only home that would have ever truly been mine. I found the photograph at a small antique store in Quebec City's lower town, one of those cluttered shops where every surface is covered with objects from forgotten lives. I'd been browsing on a Saturday afternoon in September 2022, looking for nothing in particular, just killing time before meeting a friend for dinner. The photograph was in a box of old pictures near the back of the store, mixed in with dozens of other portraits from the late 1800s and early 1900s. Most were individual or family portraits, the kind you see in every antique shop, stern-faced Victorians staring at the camera, their lives reduced to a single frozen moment. But this one was different. It was a group portrait, maybe 30 or 35 people arranged in rows in front of a large wooden building. The photograph was mounted in a simple frame, the glass slightly foxed with age. The people were dressed in work clothes, overalls, heavy shirts, boots. The men had thick mustaches and weathered faces. There were a few women too, wearing simple dresses and aprons. They all looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from physical labor. What caught my attention was the building behind them. It was massive, clearly industrial, with large doors, and what looked like loading equipment visible at the edges of the frame. A lumber mill maybe, or a factory. And the people standing in front of it had that look of workers posing reluctantly for a company photograph. The price tag said $15. I bought it without really knowing why. Something about it appealed to me, the historical quality, the anonymous faces, the glimpse into a working life from over a century ago. I brought it home and hung it in my living room, above a bookshelf where I kept other historical pieces I'd collected over the years. It fit perfectly with the aesthetic I'd been cultivating, a mix of vintage and modern, acknowledging the past while living in the present. For the first few weeks, I barely noticed it. It was just part of the background, one piece among many in my apartment. But then I started paying closer attention. I was reading one evening, glancing up occasionally at the photograph, when I noticed something odd. One of the men in the back row, a tall figure with a thick beard, seemed to have his arm raised slightly. I was certain I'd looked at this photograph dozens of times, and I didn't remember him having his arm up like that. I got up and looked more closely. The man's arm was definitely raised, his hand at about shoulder height, but maybe I'd just never noticed before. There were so many people in the photo, so many details to track. I went back to my reading, but the thought nagged at me. That night, before bed, I looked at the photograph again. The man's arm looked lower now, not quite at shoulder height anymore, more like chest height. I told myself I was imagining things, that memory was unreliable, that I was probably confusing this photograph with some other image I'd seen. But over the next few days, I kept noticing small changes. A woman in the second row whose face had been turned to the side was now facing forward. A man on the far left, who'd had his arms crossed, now had them at his sides. Subtle shifts in position, nothing dramatic, but definitely different from how I remembered them. I started to feel uneasy. I considered that maybe I'd bought a reproduction, that maybe there were multiple versions of this photograph, and somehow my mind was conflating them. But the frame was clearly old. The photograph itself was on original period paper, and the foxing on the glass had that authentic look of genuine age. To settle my mind, I took a photograph of the photograph with my phone, a clear, high-resolution image that I could refer back to, that would prove whether the people in the frame were actually moving, or if I was just losing my grip on reality. I checked it 3 days later. I pulled up the photo on my phone and compared it to the actual framed photograph hanging on my wall. They were different. Not hugely different, but unmistakably different. In my phone photo, taken 3 days earlier, the people were arranged in specific positions. In the current photograph, several of them had shifted. The bearded man's arm was now fully extended, pointing at something off camera. The woman who'd been facing forward was now looking directly at whoever was viewing the photograph, her expression more intense than I remembered. And they were closer. Not all of them, but several people in the back rows had moved forward, filling gaps between the people in front of them. The group was more compact, more tightly arranged, like they were pressing toward the camera. I felt ice run down my spine. This wasn't memory failure. This wasn't my imagination. The people in this photograph were moving. I took the photograph down from the wall and examined it closely, looking for any mechanism that might explain this. Maybe it was some kind of lenticular print, the kind that shows different images depending on the angle you view it from. But no, it was a genuine silver gelatin print on period paper. There was no trickery, no hidden technology. I placed it face down in a drawer, suddenly not wanting it in my living room anymore. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. Who were these people? Where was this photograph taken? And why were they moving? I started researching. I posted the photograph online in historical forums, asking if anyone recognized the building or the people. I contacted the antique store where I'd bought it, asking if they knew anything about its provenance. The store owner remembered the photograph. It had been part of an estate lot they'd purchased from a house in Beauport. The previous owner had died with no living relatives, and their possessions had been auctioned off. The owner had no other information. I searched newspaper archives, looking for any references to lumber mills or factories in Quebec around 1910. I found dozens of them, but none that matched the building in the photograph. Then, late one night, I found it. A small article in Le Soleil, dated the 17th of May, 1910. Incendie, fatal à la scierie de Beauport. Fatal fire at Beauport sawmill. The article described a catastrophic fire that had destroyed a lumber mill in Beauport, killing 37 workers who'd been trapped inside when the building's exits became blocked. The fire had started in the early morning hours, and by the time firefighters arrived, the building was fully engulfed. The article included a list of the victims' names and a small note that a photograph of the workers had been taken the day before the fire for the company's records. 37 people. The article said 37 people had died. I counted the people in my photograph. 36. I counted again. 37. I kept miscounting, losing track, the faces blurring together. I pulled the photograph out of the drawer where I'd hidden it. The people had moved again. They were closer to the front now, their faces more visible, their expressions clearer. And I could see what I hadn't noticed before. Many of them looked terrified. Not all of them, but enough. Their faces carried an expression of dread, of knowing what was coming. This was the photograph taken the day before the fire. These were the 37 workers who would die the next morning, posing for a company portrait that would become their final memorial. And they were moving. Slowly, over days and weeks, they were changing positions, moving toward the front of the group, pressing closer to the camera, closer to me. I should have destroyed it, should have burned it or thrown it away or returned it to the antique store. But I couldn't. Some compulsion made me keep it, made me check it regularly to see how much they'd moved, how much closer they'd gotten. Every few days, I'd take a new photograph with my phone, documenting their progress. The changes were small but consistent. The people in the back rows gradually moving forward, those in the front rows becoming larger, their faces more detailed. All of them pressing toward the edge of the frame, toward the camera, toward whoever was looking at them. Their expressions became clearer as they got closer. I could see individual features now, the desperation in their eyes, the way their mouths were open as if they were trying to speak, trying to warn me or tell me something I couldn't hear. I researched the victims, finding what information I could about who they'd been. Most were French-Canadian workers, many of them immigrants from rural Quebec who'd come to the city looking for work. Some had families. Some were barely out of their teens. All of them had burned to death in that mill on the 17th of May, 1910, trapped in a building that became an inferno. And now they were moving through a photograph, approaching the viewer, getting closer every day. Last week, I checked the photograph and realized that the front row was now pressed against the bottom edge of the frame. Their faces were clear, individual, no longer just anonymous workers, but real people with distinct features and expressions. And they were all looking directly out of the photograph, directly at me. Behind them, the others continued to press forward, filling the space, creating a density of bodies that hadn't been there in the original image. The photograph that had started with clear space between the rows was now crowded, packed with people all trying to reach the front. I took another photograph with my phone. Then I compared it to my very first photo from weeks ago. The transformation was stunning. What had been a loosely arranged group portrait was now a pressed crowd of desperate faces, all moving toward the edge of the frame. I'm writing this because I don't know what to do. The photograph is sitting on my table right now, and I can't stop looking at it. The people are so close now. The front row looks like they're about to step out of the frame entirely, their faces pressed against some invisible barrier that separates their world from mine. And I've started to notice something else. Behind the crowd of workers, in the background where the lumber mill should be, I can see flames. Small at first, barely noticeable, but growing. Orange and red, consuming the building, matching the descriptions from the newspaper article. The fire is catching up to them, and they're trying to escape it the only way they can, by moving forward, by pressing toward the camera, by reaching for our world where the fire can't touch them. I think I know what will happen when they reach the edge of the frame. I think I know what they're trying to do. And I'm terrified that when they finally break through, when they finally cross from their frozen moment in 1910 into my living room in 2022, they'll bring the fire with them. I can smell smoke now, faint but present, coming from the photograph, coming from the past, coming from a fire that burned over 100 years ago but is somehow still burning, still consuming, still driving 37 workers toward the only escape they can find. Toward me, toward now, toward a world where they might not have to burn. The photograph is moving again. I can see it shifting even as I write this. The faces getting larger, the flames behind them growing brighter, the smoke beginning to seep out from behind the glass. And I still can't destroy it, can't look away, can't do anything except watch as 37 people who died in a fire in 1910 get closer and closer to crossing over into my world. Soon, they'll reach the edge of the frame. Soon, I'll see what happens when the barrier between them